Guys, we have a cross up here that is really the center of everything going on at Foothills. The cross represents, and we talked about this some weeks ago, what the cross represents, but the cross represents everything that the church exists for. And if you have been to church for a while, even if you've never been to church, for the most part, and you live in America, you've heard about Jesus and what he's done. Even if you've never been to church, you have some idea of the topic of sin, and that there are things that are wrong, things that are right, and lots of people have different ideas about what that looks like. That's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the idea of temptation. Now, temptation being the draw to do something wrong. And it's really important that we understand this, because especially if you are a Christian and you want to try to live for Jesus, then you have to understand that this is going to be a reality for us. And I want to kind of explain from the very beginning where this comes from and how this works in our lives. So, in case you didn't know, this might be a review for some of you guys. In the very beginning, God created us to basically hang out with him in perfection forever. To just like eat and hang out freely with no kind of shame or burdens, but just fully enjoying the presence of God. So Adam and Eve, God created them to just hang out with him and enjoy him in the garden forever. That was the plan. However, in order for them to actually love God, in order for them to actually for it to be a relationship that's reciprocal, they had to be able to choose to love God. So God gave them a choice. He put in that garden the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and said, hey, everything that you want to enjoy can be fully enjoyed. And you can live forever. And you can enjoy me forever and all the things that I created you for. But if you choose not to do that, there's a tree that's going to kill you if you'd rather do that. It sounds like kind of an easy choice, but it wasn't. If we get that picture up there, the like iconic Adam and Eve in the garden. So the story is that Satan, the Bible describes him as a serpent, comes and tempts Eve at that tree of the knowledge of good and evil and is like, hey, it seems like God's holding out on you. It seems like maybe you're misconstruing what he said, and you are missing out on this aspect of life. God is holding out on you because he doesn't want you to fully enjoy everything. So he told them, if you eat of this tree, it's going to make you like God. So they believed that lie that God was holding out on them, which really is, in every temptation, like every sin that we commit is because we believe some lie that God's holding out on us. This was the very first time that it happened. And when they fell, this is the very first sin in history. When they fell, Adam and Eve, being the first humans ever, they gave up what God had designed them to enjoy forever. And that's what we call the fall. The fall is this moment where they introduced sin into our world. And that sin corrupted their nature and the nature of every child that they would ever have. We are descendants of Adam and Eve, and we have the same broken, we call it a sin nature, fallen nature. The Bible refers to it as our flesh. We have that as a result of this. And so it's easy to be like, cool, thanks a lot, Adam and Eve. But we mess up all the time too, so who knows that we wouldn't have been the one to just ruin everything. So they had the option. They chose sin. So now we are born with this inclination. You could be the best person in this room, and some of you guys are just like naturally good. And most things that are wrong just don't appeal to you. There are some people, you're gifted. That's not me. But even the best of us has an inclination in us that we kind of like the wrong things. There are things that God's like, hey, this is going to destroy your life. Here's what I have for you that's going to bless you. Choose these things. These things lead to judgment and lead you away from me. But there's a part of my nature that even though being a Christian, even though learning the truth, I know Okay, here's what God says. There's a part of me that's like, but I still like that. That still seems appealing. That still seems like good or fun or sometimes even better than what it seems like God is offering. But temptation is the most common human experience. Temptation is the draw to anything other than what God calls good. It's the draw to satisfy ourselves with anything else other than Him. That's what temptation is. Anything other than what God calls good, I'm trying to satisfy myself in some way other than how it's related to Him. That's what temptation is. And we can all get tempted in different ways and by different things. Here's the truth, though. That's just going to be part of our reality for as long as we are alive. God does give us a new nature as Christians. He says He takes our heart of stone and gives us a heart of flesh. The Holy Spirit comes and lives with us. But I'm still a human being on this earth. I'm not perfect yet. When I get to heaven, the Bible says that we receive new bodies, and there's this, like, I have a new nature in heaven. I have a perfect, restored nature in heaven, like I would have had if it weren't for the fall. But that's not yet. So as long as all of us are alive, we're going to experience in ourselves this desire for the wrong things. We're going to experience temptation. And so the truth is, though, we have to recognize the environment that we live in. Living in San Diego in 2021, there's some truths that we have to understand because we live in a fallen world. It's not just like Adam and Eve sinned this one time. Our world is wrecked with sin. Our world is wrecked with all the things that God's like, that's going to destroy your life. That's going to put you in rebellion against me. That's going to invite judgment into your life. Those are the things that our culture's like, yeah, those things are the best. That's what's on our billboards, even like on our freeway out here. That's what's celebrated in our schools, and everything we watch and listen to in like secular media is against the things that God calls good. We live in this culture that embraces sin, that encourages temptations to grow, and that encourages us to see giving into temptation as this like healthy, joyous, like good thing for our lives. And so I bring this up because we have to understand this. It doesn't matter if you've grown up in church your whole life. This is something that all of us have to grow in understanding more and more and more. And I hope that you guys leave tonight understanding it a little bit better. 1 Peter 5:8, it says, be sober-minded, pay attention, don't doze off. It says, be watchful, because your adversary, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Our enemy is actively looking for ways to draw us away from God. And so it says, hey, pay attention. Recognize that that's our reality. Have a realistic view of your situation, because our enemy, like a roaring lion prowling around, the enemy of our souls, the devil, is a master hunter. He knows the things that get us. You know, like an expert fisherman understands where he's fishing, understands the kind of fish that he's fishing for, what kind of bait he should use, what kind of line he should use, what time he should go fishing, when fish typically are biting and hungry, and all of those things, and how the season might affect at what time, all of those things. A hunter understands all those details and knows exactly what to use to lure prey in. Our enemy is so much more cunning than a hunter or a fisherman. He knows what bait to use. He knows our weaknesses. He knows how we normally respond. And he is not going to relent from trying to hit every button to get us to give in to the temptations that we experience. Now, as much as I would like to be able to choose which temptations I'm dealing with in my life, I know a lot of us struggle with things that we just wish we didn't and wish we could be free from. We don't get to choose. There are plenty of things that lots of us struggle with that we're like, well, I wouldn't have chosen to struggle with this, and I wish I didn't, yet we are. So I want to share with you guys tonight, how do we minimize temptation? Because so many of the struggles that we face, and I talk to and pray with high school students all the time, they're like, man, I know what I should do, but when temptation comes, I just keep doing the wrong thing over and over and over. And we find ourselves stuck in cycles of this is the worst. I'm the worst. I keep failing. Like maybe I just shouldn't follow God because we feel like we don't know how to overcome temptation, but it is something that can be overcome. So I want to look at tips and give you guys some tips on can you minimize temptation in your life. It's always going to be there. Never until the day you die are you going to be totally free from all temptation in the world. It doesn't happen. But we can minimize it because some of the things that we do invite temptation into our life. There's doors that we open that God's like, that's dumb. You should not do that. That's not going to help you. And then we find ourselves like suffering and feeling weak and unable to overcome. And so I want to give you guys tips for minimizing that. Some very simple questions. You might recognize them. Who, what, when, where, how, and then a couple others I'm gonna go over. All right, who? When I talk about minimizing temptation, who is it that you are around when you find yourself most tempted in whatever situations you know you struggle? In whatever situations you are inclined to do what you know is not right, who are you typically around in those situations? Because if you can identify that, if you can understand, oh, there are certain people that are not good for me. There are certain people that I tend to stumble in certain ways around a lot more than others. It gets a lot easier. And something that we say is, well, Jesus hung out with sinners. And so, I'm going to hang out with my friends who are doing whatever stuff that they're doing. Hebrews 7:26 says Jesus was separated from sinners. It doesn't mean that he didn't spend time with them. It doesn't mean he didn't love them. It doesn't mean he didn't speak truth to them. But it means that the way that he lived his life and in the places, in the areas that he associated with people, he was not hanging out with prostitutes while they were prostituting themselves. He was not hanging out with tax collectors while they were extorting money from people. They were in situations where he had influence over them, and he was drawing them to the Father. So the way that he lived and acted was separated from sinners. For you guys, if you want to minimize temptations in your life, some of the things you have to recognize is that there are people that are going to increase temptation in your life. And if you're serious about not wanting to be slaves to sin, if you're serious about wanting to follow God, then you have to recognize who those people might be in your life. The Bible says that bad company corrupts good morals, because when we're just hanging out around temptation all the time, it's fairly inevitable that over time we're going to begin giving in. It's going to become not such a big deal. The next question, where? Where am I most tempted to sin? Where do I struggle the most? It might be like certain circumstances in my life, but lots of the time, when I was in high school, it was like a physical where. I knew my friend's house, my friend Dustin that I hung out with all the time in high school, he was my best friend. His house is where we would get in trouble. His house is where I'd be like, hey, Mom, I'm staying at Dustin's, and I knew, like, we're not doing anything decent tonight. Like, I know we're going to go get in trouble because Dustin's parents didn't care and had no rules. And so back when I was trying to think of, I was growing and I want to follow God, I didn't want to keep being a slave to sin and making mistakes over and over and over. And I thought about where are the places that I struggle the most? And for me, it was Dustin's house. And so I thought about, if I'm going to minimize temptation, I need to separate myself from places that cause me to be the most tempted. Now, that seems really like common sense and simple, but we don't do that a lot. I've talked to so many of you guys who are struggling, and you keep going back to the situations and the places that cause you to stumble, that leave you in anguish with guilt and shame, that leave you frustrated. But if you can identify where are those places and do something about it and set boundaries in these areas, it's going to help you. When I was in high school, I told my mom at this time, it took some courage, but I was so tired of giving in to temptation over and over and over. And I was like, hey, Dustin's house, where I'd been going for years and stayed like every weekend? I was like, you can't let me go there. If I tell you I'm going to Dustin's house, it means that I'm going to go do stupid things that I'm going to regret. Like, don't let me hang out over at Dustin's house. And Dustin coming over to my house wasn't so much of an issue, but I knew in that situation, it was going to be a problem for me. And I had to set up some kind of boundary for it. The what? What causes me to be tempted? There might be some like physical things. When I started getting serious about Jesus, there were some things that I realized like just added extra temptation in my life. There are things that even though like I wasn't fully down with it, things I had hidden in my room as like a, just in case I decide that I want to do this or smoke this or like go here, I have an option to do this thing. What are the things that you maybe have? What are the things that you have access to? It might be stuff on your phone, it might be your phone itself. What are the avenues for temptation for you? And how can you minimize that? How can you set up some kind of blocks or guards to help you? Because I know for me, if I just kept all of those things that were a regular temptation to me, I would just continue to fail over and over and over. Because as much as I might be motivated or feel like I really want to pursue God, I'm stuck with this broken sin nature that likes the wrong things. And as long as I'm constantly tempting that nature, it's going to be very, very hard to walk in victory, to walk closely with the Lord. When? Again, like what circumstances do you find yourself most tempted? Is it times where you're tired? Times where you're frustrated? Maybe just like really excited or hyper? So if I can recognize, okay, when are the times that I struggle the most? It might help me to set up some things in my life so that I could have victory, because if I just kept being in those same situations over and over and over, it was not going to work out well for me. And for me, in high school, I was addicted to pornography for years. Before I followed Jesus, pornography was a very regular part of my life. And as I began coming to church and realizing how destructive it was to my life and my relationship with God, I began thinking through this process and going through these questions and asked the when question. And I knew, like, when I'm home and my parents aren't home from work yet, like that time after school, before they get home, is my biggest time of struggle. And so if I got serious, and at that time I did, I was like, all right, how do I minimize temptation then if I recognize the when? And so I made a decision, like, I'm gonna hang around other friends. I had family like around and in town. I was gonna occupy myself enough that I didn't have to be stuck at home by myself in the time that I'm just most tempted and failing over and over and over and over. So for you, what is your when? What are the circumstances where you know you're inviting struggle the most into your life? And can you do something about that? Some of these, maybe you can't. Maybe the who is your own family member who's regularly encouraging you to sin. And you can't run away or move out. Sometimes you can't help it. But every area that you can help it and do something, it's worth it. Do it. Identify. This is a huge one, and I want to explain what I mean. Christianity, and I'm gonna touch on this, is not just about, hey, don't sin, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And sometimes it feels that way. And just based on what I've talked about so far, you might have that idea. But life with God is so much more than that. Life with God is about partnering with Him to live out your purpose. And when I say identify, what I mean is identify yourself with Jesus outwardly whenever you can. When you are living your life around the people that you are around and whatever situations you are in, whoever is around you, do everything you can to outwardly, meaning publicly, to the people around you in your situations, identify with Jesus. What does that look like? It might look like bringing your Bible with you to school. And not hiding it under your backpack and hoping that when you open your backpack, no one sees it, but actually like carrying it or having it out, or God forbid, reading it at some point while you're at school. It might mean expressing when someone's asking you what you're doing this weekend, not conveniently leaving church out of your answer, but making known, like, yeah, I'm going to church, and that's part of what I do. Identify with Christ whenever you can. When someone asks you, oh, why don't you want to go there? Or why don't you want to do that? Or, like, why don't you want to join in whatever we have going on? Rather than just making some convenient excuse of why, saying, like, well, I'm a Christian, and that's not something that I want to be doing. All those things, terrifying. You might be really bold, and that might be really easy for you. I remember being so nervous learning to identify with Jesus when I was in high school, because I had a really horrible reputation for the things that I would do, the way that I would talk, the way that I would treat people. But when I wanted to minimize temptation in my life, I learned real quick that as I began to identify with Jesus, even in small ways, it reduced drastically the temptation that other people brought to me. Because now there was this pressure on me of, I said that I'm a Christian. Like, I put that out there. And in this moment where I'm tempted and I want to give in and be like everyone else, I already told them that I was a Christian or that I don't do that. And now I'm going to seem really like fake or hypocritical or embarrassed. And so I'm not going to. Also, something I experienced is as I identified myself with Jesus more, other people would minimize temptation for me. My friends did not care about God. They were not Christians, and they thought church was a joke. But when I said, yeah, I don't, I maybe said one time, like, yeah, I don't do that because I'm a Christian. And then other people, and this happened plenty of times in my situations where other people would like offer me alcohol, other people would offer me drugs, and my friends who don't care about God and don't care about my standards would be like, oh no, don't offer that to him. Like, he doesn't smoke. He doesn't do that. And I realized, like, oh, the temptation around me, other people are like helping to minimize because I've identified myself with Jesus, and it makes it easier for my own standards to be raised and for other people to even have a different standard for me. It's going to help you to identify with Jesus. As scary as that might be in your situations, I don't know, you might have lots of friends who are going to encourage and celebrate you identifying with Jesus, but I know not all of us are in that same situation. The last thing is serve. You want to minimize temptation in your life? Focus on other people. Because Christianity isn't just about hopefully you get through your life and don't do really bad stuff. Hopefully you live your life and don't have sex before marriage. That's not all that Christianity is. Christianity is about being salt and light. It's about influencing other people. And the more focused you are on serving and helping other people, the less time and energy and attention you're going to be able to pay to yourself and your own temptations. It's crazy. But as you're focusing on other people, you're going to realize, oh yeah, I haven't really thought about that in a while. Oh, that hasn't really been as big of a deal. Because you're focused on serving others, it makes it easier. 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, no temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to man. And God is faithful, and he's not going to allow you to be tempted beyond what you can handle. But with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. How many of you guys have ever heard someone say to you, God doesn't give you more than you can handle? Okay. Lots of people love to quote that verse, and they always think it means that God's not going to let really hard stuff happen in your life. Like, God's not going to let you have so much sorrow that you can't endure it. Well, here's the thing. That's not what that verse is saying at all. This verse is specifically in reference to temptation. And what God says is, I'm never going to let you be tempted so much that you can't endure it. I'm never going to let temptation come against you so strongly that you have no choice but to give in to sin. So whatever temptation you ever faced in your life, God's like, you actually have the ability to overcome it. You don't have to give in. You don't have to do that. You don't have to say that. You don't have to act like that. You don't have to treat people like that. Whatever your feelings are, whatever your reaction is, whatever you're tempted in, God's like, you don't have to do that. Because I'm not going to let it be so strong that you don't have a choice. And he says, whatever temptation comes up, I'm going to help you have some way to endure it. I'm going to help you to have some escape, some way out. Keeping the commandments of God, you guys, is a joy. It's not a burden. It's not a restriction. But it brings us joy as we walk in peace. It brings us intimacy with God. It brings us in fellowship with believers. And it brings us freedom from guilt and shame. We should have that up there after John 15. So the idea, like lots of us, and I did early on in my Christian life, I thought following God and obeying his rules just seemed like so much work. Like, okay, I can't do this, I can't do that, I have to like change this here. And the more that I got to know him and walk with him, the more I found, oh, there's life in this. This is actually all the things that I want, I find when I obey and walk with God. And all of the worst times of my life and the worst experiences that I've had in times that I was living in rebellion against God, doing whatever I wanted. We can overcome temptation. Whatever you're struggling with. I remember having things that like, and I know some of you guys have had these thoughts. Whenever we talk about sin, there's like something that like pops up in our own minds. Whenever we're talking about struggle, there's that one thing that like immediately jumps to the forefront of your mind. And I remember in high school thinking, God, if I could just get over this one thing, I would be so perfect. My life with you would be so good if just this thing was done. And I found something really interesting. Once that thing was over, there was just another thing. And now, there's still those things. And when I'm over these things, there'll be new things after. But here's something great, is that whatever struggle you're facing, whatever temptation is drawing you away from God and into sin, we can actually overcome it. Even though that process of overcoming is something that we're going to be going through our entire life. But in that process is growth. In that process is maturity and intimacy with God. In that process is peace and joy and hope and freedom. So God, and we talk about this a lot, God has told us, I want you to be holy or perfect like I am. That's what God says. I want you to be holy, separate, perfect, set apart, because that's what I'm like. But he didn't say that just to give us an impossible standard so we'd be like, well, I suck. Guess I'm going to give up and not try. He didn't say that without giving us the help or the means to do that, to pursue that. But we have to rely on him and realize some of these truths about temptation. Because some of us, you guys are living in defeat because you didn't understand some of this. And God wants to open your eyes to help you recognize temptation is not a slave master over you, but it can be overcome, whatever you're struggling with. Hebrews 12, 1-2, it says, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which easily entangles us. It traps us, it wraps us up. And it says, and let's run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking only at Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. So Jesus, in his torture, in his betrayal, in all of the things that led up to him being crucified, it says that he had joy before him. Well, he either doesn't feel pain, or is a psycho, or there's something else that we don't understand. He did feel pain, he felt all of it. He was not a psycho. It's because he knew on the other side of that is something so worth it and so good that he would gladly do it. And he did. And it was to offer us salvation and a way to have a relationship with him. And so for that joy, he could endure whatever was before him, in that case being tortured and crucified. For us, there's a mentality that we need to have and recognize that the struggle against temptation is not fruitless. It's not just a Christian like chore that I'm supposed to do, but God has life for me. And part of enjoying that life is getting over this uncomfortable hurdle of overcoming temptation in my life. Now, again, it's not like, oh, well, I did it that one time, that one future quest, or that one time at the mission, I said I wasn't going to do that thing anymore, and now I'm good. It's this lifelong process, but it's worth it because on the other side of that is always more, is always something better in our life with God. And so I want to share some truths with you guys that we need to understand. Overcoming temptation is harder in the culture that we live in, and it sucks. It sucks that it's this way. I'm sorry for you guys. It's a lot harder for you guys to overcome temptation because our culture embraces sin so much. Our culture makes excuses for our sin and tells you, that's not your fault. You're not responsible for your actions and the way that you gave into that temptation. Our culture is like, oh, if you're unhealthily fearful and anxious because you're not actually making any effort to take control of your thoughts, well, that's just because you suffer from anxiety and you can't help it. You have nothing to do with that. Our culture is like, oh, you struggle with same-sex attraction? Well, that's because you were born gay and you need to embrace who you are and don't treat it like a temptation. It's your identity. Our culture is like, oh, you feel uncomfortable or like you don't fit in. You have some like fleeting thought or desire. Our culture is like, oh, there's some identity that you need to embrace and you just need to live that out for the rest of your life. Our culture is like, oh, sexual immorality, go for it. It's really natural. You're young. Go experiment, try it out. It doesn't matter. It's healthy. Same thing with drugs and alcohol. Our culture glorifies these things, makes excuses for us to give into them, and it makes it so much harder for us to overcome temptation in our life. But it is worth it to fight temptation, even if it's for the rest of our lives. Having victory over temptation doesn't mean that it goes away. There are struggles that, I am friends with plenty of mature Christian guys who've been walking with the Lord and fighting temptation in their lives, and they're married and they have families, and they're still struggling with lust and still struggling with pornography, just like they did when they were, 11 years old, who are now 30s, 40s, 50s. There's a struggle that, sometimes we have this idea that well, whatever I'm struggling with, I'm just going to get over it, and then I'll be good. You might struggle with the same temptation for the rest of your life, but it doesn't mean that you can't overcome it. To overcome temptation means I don't let this thing have power over me. I recognize it for what it is. My sin nature is inclined towards this thing, and I regularly say no. I regularly decline that, and I walk towards what God's calling me to. You know that every mature Christian that you know in your life, the reason that they're a mature Christian is because they've learned to do that. It's not because they don't have temptations. It's not because they don't struggle. It's not because sin isn't enticing to them. It's because they've learned, oh, it's worth it to say no to that temptation over and over and over and over. And they grow as a result of it. It's worth it. Romans 8:18, it says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time, the things that I'm going through, the things I'm struggling with, are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And so what Paul is saying is, hey, yeah, there's a struggle right now. When he's writing, it's like, it's tough to follow God. Sometimes we're persecuted, sometimes we suffer, sometimes our flesh suffers. Like when we talk about overcoming temptation, it doesn't feel pleasant to deny ourselves. When you want to go to that place, you want to do that thing, you want to look at that thing on your phone, you want to experience that feeling, whatever that is, it's unpleasant to deny yourself in that moment. And this reminder from Paul is like, hey, that tiny little bit of discomfort you might feel to set some boundary, to work to overcome temptation, is so worth it. Because there's something on the other side that says it's not even worthy to be compared with what God has. It's not even close. But I know in that moment it can seem like this desire is so weighty, and we make that trade-off of like, yeah, God has something better, but right now this seems really good. And we make that trade-off over and over, and we find ourselves enslaved to sin, wondering why we're frustrated and ashamed and far from God. Another truth you need to understand about temptation before we leave tonight is that you are not defined by temptation. We're not going to do this, but if every one of us wrote on these walls in front of everybody, what's the greatest temptation in your life? I think we'd all probably feel very enlightened about each other. We'd all be very embarrassed writing down whatever that thing was. We'd probably all be, I don't know, maybe surprised at each other's things. We're not defined by our temptation. You're not. Now, granted, we can make some decisions that invite temptation. I've done that in my life. But a lot of temptations that we struggle with, a lot of temptations we just wish weren't an issue, we didn't ask for them. We don't want them. You're not defined by the things that you're tempted by, as much as some people would like to have you believe that. Nor are you powerless against it. There's no struggle that you're going to face in your life towards sin that's just like, well, I can't do anything about it. I guess this is how it is. I guess this is how God made me. I guess I'm just messed up and, my brain or my body or my heart doesn't work like everyone else's. That's not how it is. Hebrews 4:15, it says, we don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus is our high priest. And what he's saying is he understands that weakness. Jesus understands that proclivity in us to want the wrong things. That weakness, when he came as a man, he saw and understood, and he was tempted. And it says, this one, our high priest, it says, has been tempted in all things, just as we are. But he didn't sin. But he understands the struggle of it. Jesus understands your struggle with sin. He understands the temptations, and he says that he sympathizes with your weakness. Jesus wants to set you free from being a slave to sin. He wants you to walk in what he created you for. It grieves him to see us stuck in a pattern of sin, maybe not knowing, I can actually overcome temptation. I don't have to just give in to whatever I'm tempted by or whatever I'm feeling, or I don't have to embrace it as an identity. But the next point, though, is you must be proactive against temptation and know that it leads to freedom and joy. You have to be proactive. You can't just be lazy. You can't just show up to the mission, hear a message about temptation, and think that now the rest of your life is going to change. You have to do something about it. And I can't spell that out for you. In your own heart, I encourage you guys to seek the Lord and be like, God, what does it look like for me to do something about this? Maybe go through that list of who and what and when and think about those things. But you have to be proactive. Otherwise, you cannot expect that you're going to have any kind of victory over temptation in your life. Lastly, we can't do it alone. We need to be seeking the Lord. That's the most important part, by the way, of fighting against sin. If your goal is just don't sin, don't sin, don't sin, don't sin, that's not a winning recipe. You're not going to be victorious. The more that you're following and loving and pursuing Jesus, the easier it is to not sin. If you're just focused on don't sin, don't sin, don't sin, you're missing the whole point. Jesus didn't die to keep you from sinning. He died so that you might know him and have a relationship with him and pursue him. And as you do that, you leave sin and the old life and the dead things behind, and you don't want them in the same way. God uses other people, you guys, to encourage you and to instruct you and to correct you. This right now is part of God using someone else to help bring this to your attention. Are you open to other people speaking in your life? Being part of the body means drawing life and encouragement and even conviction from other people around us. That's why we make a big deal about you guys being in small groups, coming to things like camp, trying to let you guys know, this isn't just a class that we want you to show up to and then leave just so you can check off that you attended. The church is meant to be a family. And yeah, it can take time to get involved and get connected, but God wants to use other people to help you follow him. When you have other people around you who are also trying to overcome temptation, even though they might not be perfect, it's an encouragement and a positive peer pressure to I also want to be doing that. I also don't want to be living some lifestyle that dishonors the Lord. And we need to be regularly reminded, which is what this is. It's a reminder. I don't know that a lot of this was brand new information that just blew your mind, but it's a reminder because we forget about it. We don't think about it. We get lazy. We get distracted. I want to invite the band up here. I know what it's like to come to groups like this, because I did very often in high school, and just think about that thing that was man, if this wasn't holding me back, I'd be loving God so well. If this thing wasn't taking over my life, I'd be so much happier. Like, oh, if I could just overcome this one area of struggle, I'd feel so much better. I'd feel so much closer to God. I get that. And all throughout Scripture, God tries to make it clear over and over and over, hey, I have something better for you than this temptation is offering you, and you have to trust me in the process, and it's worth it. That process, you guys, is worth it. And I hope that when you leave here tonight, you think about, what does it look like for me to be proactive against temptation in my life? What does it look like for me to not be lazy or just to feel stuck and to have given up? Maybe you have something that you're like, yeah, I tried really hard to get over that, and then I just gave up because I couldn't do it. And God's like, nope, I have more for you than that. You don't have to live like a slave to sin, like you can't overcome it.